two murders are linked by unusual bullets. But linking them to the killers seems like a shot in the dark. A woman points the finger of blame at her killers. But catching them depends on a forensic technique that hasn't been invented yet. When detectives on the trail of cattle rustlers uncover what looks like serial murder, they call on forensics to help them round up their suspects. They say that a burden shared is a burden halved, but when partners team up for murder, the weight of their crime can drag them both down. The burden of proof is on forensics to capture partners in crime. November 19th, 1989, around 11:30 p.m. on the mean streets of Trenton, New Jersey, a passerby discovered a brutal murder. The victim was 38-year-old Francis C. Bodner, a driver for Golden Cabs.
All right, lab tech over here, please. Lab tech.
Officers at the scene examined the victim's body and combed the taxi for clues. Along with the slugs, they recovered a small metal disc with a raised edge, almost like a miniature bottle cap. It was a puzzling find. Detective Lieutenant Michael Salvatore felt it held the key to solving this crime.
Right, come on, Mike. Tell me about that case from last night. Because no one had ever seen that type of bullet before, that there was a possibility that the bullet had been created by an enthusiast, someone who loads their own bullets at home.
Hey, gentlemen.
If that were true, the bullets would be almost impossible to trace. But Salvatore hadn't seen the last of them. Just 4 hours later, he was called to another murder scene. A second taxicab driver was shot dead. Willie Rogers, age 33, had been discovered in the taxi he drove for the Diamond Cab Company.
What do we got, guys?
Again, investigators recovered the same odd metal disc, along with a spent bullet.
There she is. That's what we've been looking for.
And in both cases, witnesses reported seeing 3 black men in the taxi prior to the murder. The evidence technicians soon produced another clue, a fingerprint lifted from the first taxi's front passenger side door. The Trenton Police Department's evidence lab transmitted the print to the National Fingerprint Database, a clearinghouse for fingerprint evidence from around the country. It would take some time before the results came back. And there was no guarantee the print on the cab belonged to the killer. The Mercer County Medical Examiner performed the autopsies later that day. Bodner and Rogers were both killed by a single shot to the back of the head, execution style. The executioners left behind little besides the unusual bullets. To solve the execution-style murders, Trenton police had to rely on ballistic evidence taken from the crime scene. It's all they had. By 11 o'clock on the morning the drivers were killed, Trenton police had delivered the bullets to the New Jersey State Police Lab's Captain Mike Leisinger. The bullets perplexed him as much as they did Detective Salvatore, and Leisinger had been a ballistics expert for more than 20 years. His reference books showed that the little metal cap was called a gas check.
The gas check is very unusual because you never see this in commercial ammunition. This is the first time we have ever encountered a gas check as long as I've been in ballistics. This was something unique to us.
A gas check is placed on the base of the bullet to keep it from melting and clogging the gun barrel with lead. Many people who make their own bullets use gas checks. But Lysinger could tell these bullets were commercially manufactured, though no American company made them. Now, he had to determine what sort of gun fired them. Using the lab's stereo microscope, he identified the pattern of alternating grooves and the spaces between the grooves, or lands, left on the bullets as they sped through the gun barrel. These lands and grooves are a gun's class characteristics, and ballistics experts can use them to identify the type of weapon most likely to have left them on a bullet. Lysinger determined that the Trenton gas check bullets had a pattern of 5 lands and grooves with a twist to the right. He told Salvatore to look for a Taurus revolver, a Ruger revolver, or a Smith & Wesson. All of these were in common use among Trenton criminals. Any one of thousands of weapons could have left its mark on the bullets. Investigators didn't even know where to start looking. Before long, however, they got their first lead. In the early morning of November 27th, an anonymous caller told Trenton police that 2 of the gunmen were twins named Ron and John Allen. Later that same day, John Allen was picked up for smashing car windows during a street fight. Investigators had him brought up for an interview. John Allen said he had been with his twin Ron and their friend all evening the night the cabbies were killed. They had hung out at a couple of clubs until 3 a.m. Salvatore wasn't convinced, but without physical evidence tying John Allen to the killings, he had nothing. When John Allen's prints didn't match the one pulled from the taxi, detectives wondered about his brother. They pulled Ron Allen's prints from a previous arrest record. Trenton police compared Ron Allen's file print against the one left on the taxi. The point-by-point comparison was a match. Ron Allen had been in the murdered man's vehicle. That wasn't enough to prove he was the murderer. Taxis see dozens of fares each day, but the match told investigators they were on the right track.
Hey, what's up, baby?
Police learned that the Allen brothers were Trenton locals who became involved with a rough and dangerous gang called the New York Boys.
Hey, you don't want none of me. You don't want any of me. Hey, he don't want any of me. I'm
Turf
telling you
was
now.
at a premium in the Big Apple, so the gangs there started colonizing New Jersey.
Hey, you don't want none of me.
The Allens were recruited.
Hey, you don't want any. You don't want any.
I mean, Chief Williams knew all.
Detectives continued to interview friends and enemies of the Allen brothers, hoping to poke holes in their alibi, hoping for anything they could use.
On the street, just about everybody knew what was going on, but unfortunately, in a lot of the homicide cases I've worked on, people are very reluctant to come forward and give that information up.
The information they gathered continued to implicate the Allen brothers, but stopped short of being enough to arrest them. Then, on the evening of December 20th, 1989, one courageous eyewitness stepped forward. When police assured him that he'd be safe, he agreed to talk. He told police that he was parked directly behind the first victim's taxi during the crime. He saw Bodner shot from behind and heard the window shatter. Then he drove past the cab, fast, and saw 3 men going through Bodner's pockets. He identified Ron and John Allen as 2 of the 3 men he had seen in the cab that night. The dragnet was closing in on the Allen brothers. But a single fingerprint and a rushed eyewitness account might not be strong enough to win the maximum sentence for these alleged killers. detectives still needed to find a way to use the killer's ammunition against them.
This is what I'm talking about right here.
The investigation into the gang-style murder of 2 Trenton taxi drivers was making slow progress. Police had a witness who could place the Allen brothers at the scene of one driver's murder. Now they had to place a gun in their hands. They got help from a police informant.
But what do you got for me? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You interested?
He told police that the Allens had tried to sell him guns and ammunition several weeks back, and that the guns had 2 bodies on them, 2 murders.
Yo, let me think about that. Yo, I just
He didn't buy them.
All right. Think about it, right? Get back to it.
To prove the Allens' involvement, Detective Salvatore needed those guns. He sent the informant out to get them. The informant risked his life to do so.
On vacation today? Within 2 days, we received a phone call from the informant, and he had the weapons.
He turned over the 2 revolvers and a fistful of bullets that he had just purchased from the Allens.
Recently, our cabbies. We also have
Salvatore sent the guns to the ballistics lab to compare with the slugs recovered from the taxis.
It's the same class character.
Both guns had 5 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist. Both could have fired the bullets found at the crime scenes. Another test would determine if one of them actually had. The guns were test-fired. The marks on the test-fired slugs from one of the guns matched the fatal slugs. Investigators had found the weapon they were looking for, the gun that killed Francis Bodner and Willie Rogers. Police obtained the warrants they needed to arrest the Allens. Officers swarmed over the places where they usually hung out. They found John Allen and brought him in. Ron Allen called Detective Salvatore a few hours later, asking about his twin. Detectives had the call traced.
While I was talking to Ron on the phone, we had a couple teams out here in West Trenton, a couple detective teams poised in various locations out here because we knew this is where they frequented and where he probably was. And as soon as we got the information from the Bell operator, we fed that information to our units on the street, and they came here and they forced their way into the house and arrested Ron Allen, who was still on the phone with me at the time of the arrest.
Tell me your story one more time.
At first, Ron Allen denied everything. Then, investigators listed the evidence against him.
Tell me what
Allen gave it up, for him, for his twin, and for a third man. Allen said on the night of the murder, he and his twin were out with a man named Greg Williams. He claimed Williams pulled the trigger. By 7 that evening, an arrest warrant had been issued for Williams. 5 days later, authorities arrested him in Ocilla, Georgia. But Salvatore was never convinced for a minute that Williams had been the trigger man.
The weapon used in the murder of the 2 taxi drivers were guns owned by the Allen brothers. There were guns carried by the Allen brothers. There were guns held by the Allen brothers. So it was not likely that Gregory Williams possessed the gun and killed the cab drivers. We believe that it was the Allen brothers who killed them.
On July 10, 1990, Ronald and John Allen were convicted of the taxicab murders. On August 16th, they were sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Allen twins will be over 100 years old when they become eligible for parole. For his part in the crime, Greg Williams was sentenced to life as well. The Allen twins and Greg Williams killed 2 men for just over $100. Money they intended to spend in New York City to buy drugs they could peddle in Trenton. In jail, the Allens bragged about robbing and killing the taxi drivers, saying they were easy targets.
With ballistics evidence, so were the Allens. The Allen brothers found their victims on the streets. But staying at home doesn't necessarily mean staying safe. Los Angeles, April 17, 1991. On this morning, Marilyn Rush knew something was wrong when her friend Joan Dawley didn't show up for work. Joan was never late, and she wasn't answering her phone. Concerned, Marilyn drove to the house Joan shared with her husband Dennis to make sure she was all right. Even though Joan's car wasn't in the driveway, Marilyn went inside to check on her friend. She found her in the bedroom.
Joan? 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 Oh, God.
When the LAPD responded to the crime scene, it looked at first glance like a botched burglary. The bedroom had been ransacked. Joan Dawley's bruised hands told investigators that she had tried to defend herself. The Dawleys' neighborhood had had a rash of break-ins, and this one matched the pattern. Outside, a screen had been removed from an open window, and a ladder stood beneath it. But as police worked the scene, they began to compile a growing list of clues that didn't fit with the burglary scenario. The damp ground under the window had no footprints or marks from the ladder. The windowsill, where the burglars allegedly climbed in, was clean of any dirt or scuff marks.
You see any dirt, mud, broken leaves, pieces of leaves? Nothing out there.
And $100 was left in plain sight on the kitchen counter. It appeared as if someone had worked hard to make it look like Joan Dawley had interrupted a burglary. LAPD Detective Paul Tippin wasn't convinced.
All of these things together with the evidence at supposedly the point of entry didn't add up. Initially, of course, you look at it as a burglary murder, but as it progressed, it turned out to be a fabricated crime scene, basically.
Police suspected the murderer had contrived the scene after killing Dawley. Officers notified the victim's husband, Dennis Dawley, and asked him some routine questions.
I know this is a difficult time.
If you have that type of a murder, you're going to have to eliminate the spouse. You have to get over that hurdle before you can go to the next step.
When it's fresh, so we can start.
Dennis told police that he and Joan were high school sweethearts, married 35 years. He'd last spoken to his wife the night before. She was still asleep when he left the house at 4:45 that morning for his job at the golf course. He had no idea what could have happened or who could have wanted his wife dead. He said he couldn't bear to stay in the house. If police had more questions, they could reach him at the home of his daughter, Debbie Myers.
Evidence that you can gather.
With Dennis Dawley above suspicion, Tippin pressed forward in his search for clues to this hideous murder.
We'll now take that bag.
The autopsy found that the victim had been killed by blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Tests turned up no evidence of sexual assault. The coroner discovered traces of blood and foreign matter under the victim's fingernails. But investigators had no certain way of telling whether it was the killers or the victims. In these early days of DNA technology, accurate testing required large samples. Testing the traces of material from under the victim's nails would jeopardize the sole piece of potential evidence.
My first question was, do you think we can get DNA evidence from any evidence under her nails? And the answer was yes, but once we do it, then we may destroy all of the evidence through the analysis. So I was real reluctant at that time to do it.
The risk was too great. Tippin would have to rely on old-fashioned detective work to solve this one, at least for now. 4 days after the murder, Joan Dawley's missing car reappeared. Her son-in-law spotted it in a parking lot across the street from the card store where Joan had worked. Police found her keys, but no useful clues. Two days after the victim's funeral, Detective Tippin called Dawley at his daughter's house to see if he had noticed anything else the burglars may have taken.
All right, see you when I get back.
But
Okay.
Debbie Myers told Tippin that her father was gone. Dawley said that he needed to get away. He planned to spend a few days quietly fishing at Lake Mead. Myers told Tippin the name of the Las Vegas hotel where her father usually stayed. Tippin's experience told him it was strange for a man to leave town so soon after his wife's murder. He asked a pal in the Las Vegas Metro Police Department to keep an eye on Dawley. Tippin's opinion of the bereaved husband was about to change. The Joan Dawley murder investigation took a strange turn when Dennis Dawley turned up in a Vegas casino at 3:30 in the morning. He was in the company of a woman. Detective Tippin received surveillance photos of the pair. After checking around, the woman was identified as Brandita Taliano. The news didn't sit well.
After I determined that he was in Las Vegas with a female, 2 days after he had buried his wife of 35 years, I became very suspicious.
Tippin looked into Taliano's background. He found that her rap sheet included convictions for prostitution and drugs. She had no fixed address. He also discovered that Taliano had been staying in the Mission Hills Motel in LA during the time of Joan Dawley's murder. The motel was just a quarter-mile down the road from where Joan's car had been recovered. This was worth a closer look.
So I went to the Mission Hills Motel, talked with the manager, and basically what happened was he gave me a list of phone calls and phone numbers going back a month.
Tippin checked the list of Taliano's outgoing calls. She had phoned Dawley's home, the golf complex where he worked, and a local bowling alley that was his favorite hangout.
Police Department, Miss Taliano?
It was time to pay a call on Taliano. He traced her to a North Hollywood motel.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Tippin from the Police Department. I have a team
Detectives
of
approached
officers
Taliano and asked to search her room.
Here?
Surprisingly, she agreed without blinking an eye.
You wanna take that?
Generally speaking, I mean, if someone is that cooperative, they're not thinking that they have anything that may develop into a lead or lead you to believe that they were involved in a homicide.
The search turned up several pieces of jewelry. Most of it was junk. But one piece looked particularly valuable, and not the kind of jewelry Taliano would normally own. Taliano had an explanation ready. She told them that she was often hired to clean the Dawley's house. While she was there, she took some jewelry, but not entirely without Dennis's knowledge. They were having an affair.
She wanted us to believe that basically she was okay with being around Joan Dawley and Dennis. But Joan didn't know that the sexual activity was taking place.
Detective Tippin.
Detectives found a note stating that Dennis was nervous about Taliano keeping the jewelry. He wanted her to fence it. That suggested he was involved in its theft.
Very nice piece of jewelry here.
A few days later, Debbie Myers identified the jewelry. She recognized the piece that her mother always wore. If that were true, then Taliano couldn't have stolen it from the victim's jewelry box. Joan's jewelry in Taliano's possession, and a note linking Dolly to the stolen pieces. Too many coincidences were piling up too quickly. Perhaps their secret game didn't stop at theft.
Once I identified Brandita Taliano and the things that were going on with her and Dennis Dolly, it became more and more apparent that it was a conspiracy and that these two people were involved in the case.
Investigators began to believe that Joan Dolly's murder was a crime motivated by love. Not Dennis and Brandita's love for each other, but their mutual adoration for money. If Dennis divorced his wife, he'd lose half of everything he owned. Plus, Joan had recently inherited close to $100,000. Police suspected that Dennis Dolly was a shifty and dangerous man. If he and Brandita had plotted to kill Joan because Dolly wanted all of her money, then why would he want to share it with Brandita?
I was somewhat concerned about Brandita also and her situation because I thought the possibility was there that Dennis would murder Brandita just to get her out of the way.
The evidence against the pair was only circumstantial. Investigators had no physical evidence putting them at the murder scene on the morning of April 17th. But they had enough to bring them in for questioning. At least then, authorities could keep their eyes on the pair. Based on what they had gathered so far, detectives developed a strategy. They had 48 hours to either charge them or let them go. It was a calculated risk.
Interrogation room 2.
Tippin knew he didn't have the evidence to charge them, so he was gambling that once in custody, they'd crack and turn on each other.
Mr. Donovan, will you come with me, please?
Dennis admitted to meeting Brandita Taliano on the street, and basically that's all he would admit to was, yes, he was wrong and connecting up with Brandita and having her as a girlfriend, but as far as the murder or anything else, he was not involved in anything.
I'll be right back. Sure. I'm gonna go next door. Okay.
Taliano told a different story.
Hi, Miss Taliano. How are you today?
A few months before Joan's murder, Taliano had been serving time in a women's prison in Los Angeles.
Well, got a lot of loose
While
ends.
visiting her there, Dolly had asked her a favor. Did she know anyone he could hire for a big job? She assumed that meant murdering his wife.
Can you describe for me your relationship?
Taliano recommended a man named Gary Ware.
I'll let you know. He's pretty adamant about it.
You know, he called me.
Dolly's deal with Ware must have been finalized while Taliano was in prison.
Do everything.
She said Dolly never told her what happened. It was a hot lead, but investigators would need a lot more evidence to turn it into a murder charge that would stick. And Tippin's 48 hours were up. Authorities were forced to let Dolly and Taliano go. Ware was no choir boy. A man with a criminal record like his might be capable of committing murder for hire. His phone records showed that Dolly called him prior to Joan's death, but not afterward.
All of a sudden, I have him right in the middle of this homicide with phone calls that are being directed to him by Dennis Dolly. So I had to find out why those calls were being made and what his participation or involvement was.
How you doing?
Gary Ware. How you doing?
But a hardened criminal like Ware wouldn't just volunteer information to the police. Tippin spent a year trying to get him to talk. With his attorney present, Ware finally admitted to authorities that Dolly had contacted him with an interesting business proposition. The two agreed to meet. Dolly wanted Ware to kill his wife. He gave Ware $30,000 cash and told him he didn't care how Ware did it, but he wanted her gone. At first, Tippin couldn't understand why Ware would implicate himself in Joan Dolly's murder like this. As it turned out, he had an airtight alibi. On the morning the victim was murdered, he was in lockup at Chino State Prison. Tippin's most promising lead fizzled right before his eyes. After more than a year spent investigating Joan Dolly's murder, the case went cold. Though LAPD detectives had their suspicion, they still needed hard evidence placing Dennis Dolly and Brandita Taliano at the scene of the murder of Joan Dolly. One lead after another failed to pay off. Then, on the last day of February 1994, Detective Paul Tippin got a call that he'd been waiting 3 years for. In the time since Joan Dolly's murder, DNA analysis technology had been refined enormously. A new technique allowed even a tiny pinpoint of genetic material to be analyzed. Now, the lab could accurately test only a portion of the foreign matter found under the victim's nails without the risk of ruining the entire DNA sample. The lab's new testing technology, called PCR for polymerase chain reaction, encourages the DNA to carry out its natural function, continuous duplication. A carefully controlled environment of chemicals and heat works like a genetic copying machine. Colin Yamauchi is a criminalist with the LAPD Crime Lab DNA unit.
We can start with a small sample and put it in this instrument that can make hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands and millions of copies of that same DNA. So it was kind of an exciting time in forensic serology when PCR came online and we were able to utilize this technology.
With PCR, an immeasurable amount of DNA can be cultivated into a testable sample. The procedure was performed on a portion of material taken from beneath Joan Dolly's fingernails, then compared with DNA from her blood. It didn't match. Someone else's cells were under Joan Dolly's nails.
That meant that the possibility of a suspect's DNA was there. And that was very, very important to me, because now it brought about a situation where I could maybe directly connect a suspect to the victim. And that was very, very important.
Dennis Dolly's genetic material was tested against a sample from his wife's nails. It came back negative. By this time, Brandita Taliano was in prison for an unrelated crime. A warrant was issued and a blood sample obtained. This time, Tippin got his match. Now there could be no doubt. Brandita Taliano murdered Joan Dolly. But Tippin still wasn't convinced that Taliano had acted alone. Dennis Dolly's knowledge of the stolen jewelry, his attempt to hire a hitman, and a long string of incriminating phone records before the crime implicated him in the murder.
I believe truly that they were both in it, they were both involved in it, they were both there when it happened.
The jury agreed that Dennis Dolly and Brandita Taliano had conspired and murdered Joan Dolly. Nearly 4 years after her death, her killers were sentenced to 25 years to life. Dolly and Taliano believed that murder was the easy way to wealth. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones to feel that way. Some people make murder a part of their business plan. Livingston County, north central Missouri. Over 100 years ago, this was wild, rough country under the rule of frontier justice. Today, it has settled into the essence of rural America. Old-style towns surrounded by farmland. A place where farmers contend with the whims of the weather and the realities of economics. People here believe in an honest wage for honest work. At least most of them believe that. In October 1986, the Livingston County Sheriff's Department received a call from a nearby livestock auction company. A man named Dennis Murphy had passed a bad check for $6,000 to buy cattle. He had paid for the cattle, loaded them into a truck, and vanished. Though Murphy was a stranger, he appeared to be working with a local farmer named Ray Copeland. Ray had attended the auction, and while he hadn't bought any livestock, he provided a truck for the cattle Murphy had bought. Sheriff Gary Calvert paid Mr. Copeland a visit to find out more about Murphy.
He admitted that he knew Dennis Murphy, that Dennis had rented his pasture to keep those cows, and that he in fact had sold some cows to Dennis himself, and that Dennis had gave him a bad check also.
It might have been the end of the story, except that a month later, Calvert received another call about a drifter passing bad checks for about $6,000 worth of livestock. The drifter resold the cows, took the cash, and disappeared. Again, Ray Copeland had been at the auction, and it was his truck that carted the cattle away. But once again, Copeland said he was a victim too.
Before, you did 5 of them already. And
while that may have been true, Calvert had reasons for doubt. Ray Copeland had been arrested several times for passing bad checks of his own.
Yeah, we're going to have to come up with something different.
Still, Calvert had no proof that he was behind this. Both of the cattle thieves had arrest records, consistently bouncing in and out of jail on minor charges. Calvert assumed they were bound to get arrested again. He'd catch up with them soon enough. All he had to do was wait. Two years passed without any more trouble. Then, in October 1988, Calvert learned about 3 more drifters passing bad paper for good cattle. This wasn't the kind of crime Calvert had seen a lot of. Now he'd seen 5 cases in 24 months. They had to be related. When Calvert ran a check on the 2 men who'd stolen the cows 2 years earlier, he found no record of them. They hadn't been arrested again anywhere.
Misdemeanor 1.
Calvert couldn't believe that these small-time criminals had reformed into model citizens. But he didn't know where they had gone, or if Copeland might truly be involved. Calvert had heard rumors, though. Copeland's neighbors told him that he was hiring drifters from the local mission to help him at cattle auctions because he couldn't hear well anymore. Copeland supposedly promised to pay the men $50 a day to stay on his farm and not tell anyone they were there.
Let's go.
Even if those rumors were true, they didn't mean much. A year passed before Calvert got more information, and it wasn't what he expected. On August 20th, 1989, an anonymous caller to Nebraska's Crime Stoppers hotline tipped authorities to watch out for Ray and Fay Copeland of Mooresville, Missouri. The caller said that he had worked for the Copelands. Ray had made him buy cattle with bad checks and then threatened to kill him. He said he wasn't the first. He hinted that Ray was a murderer.
Jack McCormick?
On September 6, 1989, just 2 weeks after the phone tip, the anonymous caller surfaced. Jack McCormick was picked up outside Salem, Oregon, for sleeping by the side of a highway. When the police computer revealed an outstanding warrant for bad checks in Missouri, he was extradited. When he got there, he admitted making the anonymous call.
Jack, you have a slight problem with
McCormick said that Copeland met him in a homeless shelter and hired him to work on his farm. After he moved into Copeland's house, Copeland opened a bank account for him so he could buy cattle. It seemed like a square deal. But McCormick grew suspicious when he found a closet full of men's clothes that belonged to other men from the shelter. Some had their names written inside, a common practice among drifters.
$5,000.
All done.
During the 15 days he lived at the farm, McCormick said he made several cattle purchases for Ray and Fay Copeland. Fay kept the books.
Where'd you get her from? She's a shield.
But soon McCormick overdrew the bank account, and the Sullivan County Sheriff issued a warrant for his arrest. Right after that, on August 10, 1989, McCormick claimed that Copeland tried to kill him with a .22 rifle. Then, for some reason, Copeland changed his mind. McCormick fled the county. It sounded like a wild story, but the sheriff couldn't dismiss it out of hand. Then came the wildest accusation of all. McCormick said he found a human skull and leg bone on Copeland's farm.
When he suggested that what might be happening here is that Mr. Copeland may be killing people, we thought we better look into it.
Based on what McCormick told authorities, and coupled with the fact that 2 of the cattle thieves were seen with Ray Copeland, the sheriff had enough to arrest Ray and his wife Fay for charges relating to check fraud. A search warrant was issued to determine if they were up to something far worse. A drifter named Jack McCormick accused Ray and Fay Copeland of murder. He said the evidence was buried on their farm. On October 9, 1989, the couple was taken into custody.
What are you doing? Right over the wall. What's going on, sir? Sir, you're under arrest for the death. Set up. Back here in the dining room.
With the Copelands behind bars at the Livingston County Jail, the officers searched the farmhouse. They found items that seemed to substantiate Jack McCormick's account.
Why don't you go ahead and bag this rifle up?
First was the closet of men's clothes.
We have the victim's clothing up here.
Fay had been cutting them up to make a quilt. Some of the clothes had the names of the missing men in them, just as McCormick had described. The officers also found a list of men's names hidden in a camera case. It included the men who had passed bad checks. The ones who vanished had X's beside them.
Let's go ahead and keep track of that.
If McCormick was telling the truth and Copeland was a killer, Sheriff Calvert would have to find the bodies. But after a week of searching, the officers found no trace of the missing men. While the Copeland farm was being searched, TV stations began reporting on the case. Rancher Keith Albright saw the story and called the sheriff to report what he knew.
Yeah, this is Mr. Albright out here on Alaskan Road.
Albright had rented a farm just 6 miles from Copeland's.
Pretty good.
Ray had done some odd jobs for him. Albright told police that he had found some bones out in a field. At the time, he thought they were animal bones. Now, he wasn't so sure. Having found no bodies on Copeland's farm, police believed that Albright might be onto something. If Copeland were guilty, he wouldn't be careless enough to bury all his victims on his own land. They spread out to search Albright's farm. In the barn, they noticed that some areas of the dirt floor had been disturbed. They began to dig.
By the end of the day, officers uncovered 3 bodies from shallow graves on Albright's property. Calls kept pouring into the sheriff's department, and they tracked down every promising lead.
When people found out that we were suspicious of what he may have been doing, they became suspicious about everything that they had seen him doing. So we went on a lot of wild goose chases.
All right, looks like we have something down here. Don't quite know what it is.
When the bodies started turning up,
Let's see what
Copeland,
we got here.
perhaps trying to minimize his involvement, began telling wild stories. He said he overheard some strangers talking about dumping a body down a neighbor's well. Sure enough, investigators found the body of one of the missing drifters. But the lie backfired. The discovery implicated Copeland even further.
All right, let's lay it down here. We got.
The search on that farm intensified, and a 5th victim was excavated from beneath 2,000 bales of hay. Using dental records, the 5 men were positively identified a few weeks later. Among them was Dennis Murphy, pulled from his watery grave. It was a good start, but investigators needed forensic evidence to tie Copeland more directly to the murdered men. Calvert gathered the .22 rifle found in Copeland's house and a pile of .22 slugs recovered from the bodies and delivered them to the Missouri State Highway Patrol. The rifle was test-fired in their crime lab. It would leave its unique set of markings on the slugs as they hurled down the barrel. A comparison microscope was used to compare the markings. On one side, the test-fired slug. On the other, a slug pulled from one of the 5 murder victims. The marks on the slugs lined up exactly. To firearms and ballistics expert Todd Garrison, that meant only one thing.
After comparison and examinations, we could conclusively say this particular bullet had been fired from this particular Marlin firearm obtained from the Copeland farm.
Bullets from the same rifle killed each of the 5 victims. But investigators still needed to know if Fay Copeland had any role in this. The note found in the Copeland's house told volumes. Ray, who was illiterate, couldn't have written the names on the list. To see if she was the author, Calvert turned the list over to Missouri State Highway Patrol's handwriting section. Though a person's handwriting varies, certain features remain consistent. Handwriting expert Don Locke compared the note against a known sample of Fay's handwriting. He noted several distinctive characteristics. For example, the letter B always appeared in uppercase, even in the middle of a word. Locke concluded that this and other details were common to the note and to examples of Fay's handwriting. But what about the X's? It was possible that Fay had simply written the list of names and Ray had placed the X's by them as he killed the men. That would be harder to judge.
Could one simply look at the X's and positively identify those X's to someone? No. But they were there, and as I said, they were consistent with the writing that was positively identified.
Locke even compared the ink used to write the names against the ink used to write the X's. His conclusion? The same ink had been used for both. Fay Copeland wrote the names and marked the X's as her husband killed the men one by one. Locke and Garrison provided the forensic evidence to charge the Copelands with 5 counts of first-degree murder. On November 12, 1990, Fay was sentenced to death. Ray followed her on May 22, 1991. For 2 years,
Faye and Ray Copeland were the only couple on death row sentenced for the same crime. Ray Copeland cheated the executioner when he died in October 1993 at the Potosi Correctional Center. In 1999, his wife of over 50 years had her sentence reduced to life. Though neither of the Copelands ever confessed, investigators pieced together this scenario. Ray somehow came up with the idea of hiring drifters to write the checks for him.
Get that gate. Make sure that gate is locked.
Yeah, the gate. Got the gate. Come on.
After the men outlived their usefulness, or when the warrants for passing bad checks piled up,
There you go.
Copeland murdered them. And Faye kept the books. How much is a human life worth? Police estimated that the Copelands made $30,000 from their scheme. $6,000 a victim. They thought no one would notice a few missing drifters. They were wrong. It's often said that two heads are better than one. When committing murder, having a partner gives police twice as much evidence to gather and twice as much chance to catch the killers. A quiet town is racked with terror as police hunt a killer who preys on young women. A vague description and inadequate clues are all they have. The next move is up to him. Someone took great pains to try to dispose of a body. Stripped of her identity, this victim can't lead detectives to her killer. Any chance of justice must be found in the dead woman's hands. A dark night, a sharp curve, and a woman lies dead at the bottom of a canyon. It looks like an accident, but maybe that was the plan. Most people don't kill unless they're certain they can get away with it. Murderers always believe they can outwit the police. And that's their fatal error. In the late night hours on Tuesday, November 23, 1982, police in Morris County, New Jersey were visited by the mother and co-worker of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. Amy had failed to return from her job at a nearby mall. Amy's mother told police that her daughter worked at the dress store 2 nights a week. She was on her high school cheerleading team and was saving to go to college to become a chiropractor. Amy's co-workers said that Amy helped her lock up. It was around 9:30, and they were among the last at the mall. When Amy failed to return home, her mother went to the mall to look for her. Her car was the only one in the lot. Her keys were in the ignition. Amy's book bag, purse, and wallet were all on the seat. But there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, Mrs. Hoffman called Amy's co-worker. The two didn't know where else to turn. Police responded to the mall parking lot with a canine handler to track Amy. Her scent trail went cold 2 parking spaces away. Evidently, she left the mall with someone else. But who? The parking lot yielded no clues. According to Morris County Detective Sergeant John Kennecom, neither did Amy's car.
We searched the vehicle as we do routinely for fingerprints, any type of items which may assist us in the missing person, but we ultimately didn't find anything.
But that was about to change. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a man out for an afternoon walk in a secluded area of Morris County, New Jersey, made a startling discovery. The lifeless body of a young woman. He fled the scene and called police. Responding deputies from the Morris County Sheriff's Department found the victim lying in an abandoned water retention tank. From the description, police knew they had found Amy Hoffman. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The body was removed and sent off for further analysis. Investigators began scouring the area for clues, looking for anything that might help them identify Amy's killer. Bloodstains were recovered near the tank, but later tests showed they belonged to the victim. Evidence technicians gathered all that they could. Sometimes the most valuable clues masquerade as ordinary litter. The autopsy had a little more information to offer. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly and had most likely bled to death. There were indications that she'd also been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was found. Fibers and bits of foam padding clinging to her boots and clothing were the only potential evidence collected. Hoping for more information, police returned to the mall to question other employees.
I need to ask you some questions.
One woman stated that when she left the mall around 9 p.m., she saw a creepy-looking man just sitting there in his car. She thought the vehicle was an old Chevy. She only caught a glimpse of the man's face. She could not offer police a detailed description. Investigators knew they would have to work quickly.
We knew we had a major offender in our community. We knew we had somebody that was a predator. And what motivated me, as well as all the other law enforcement officers who worked in this case, is we had to capture this guy before he killed again.
But 2 weeks after Amy Hoffman was murdered, a truck driver parked at a rest stop 20 minutes from the Morris County Mall was jolted from his sleep. A terrified young woman was begging for help. She was bleeding badly and barely clinging to life. The truck driver called police. Though she'd lost a lot of blood, 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien was still conscious when the paramedics came. She told authorities that less than 1 mile from her home, a car forced her off the road. Fearing the driver of the other vehicle had been hurt in the accident, she went to see if he was okay. He brandished a knife and forced her into his car, an old Chevy. He drove her to the rest stop, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Deirdre O'Brien would not survive her injuries.
She died at the hospital, but not before giving a description of her killer.
The victim of the second homicide advised law enforcement officers that the assailant was in fact a white male. He was about the same size as the victim, that he had blue jeans on and a certain type of shirt. It was a Western type shirt.
The suspect and his vehicle matched the description of the suspect in the Amy Hoffman case. With only tiny synthetic fibers recovered from Deirdre O'Brien's clothing, investigators went to the site where she had been abducted to search for more clues. They found a tire track left in the dirt. It was photographed, and then a cast was carefully made. To preserve the impression, forensic investigators use a durable casting medium called dental stone, originally formulated for making dental casts. It sets up quickly and is more durable than traditional plaster. While the tread was only one potential clue, it was the strongest.
Most energy was put onto the tire track itself, because we could see where its location, approximately 4 feet from the victim's vehicle, that it was probably the suspect's tire.
The cast and photographs of the tread were sent to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald.
And I looked at the tread design guide book and found that there were maybe 20 different imprints similar. However, the Cyberling Snow Power tire looked the most consistent.
Detective Sergeant Kennecom carried the photo of the tread impression to shopping malls, neighborhoods, and junkyards. But he couldn't find a single tire like the one Pete McDonald described. Investigators were driven to find the killer before the killer found victim number 3.
Where it occurred?
But then a call came in. There'd been another stabbing. Investigators in Morris County, New Jersey struggled to solve the homicides of 2 young women. All of the clues pointed to a serial killer, but none pointed to a suspect. As investigators raced to identify a suspect before he could strike again, another stabbing was reported. This time, the victim was a man, but the details were familiar. 34-year-old James Kodadich told police that while he was driving, he was pulled over by an early model Chevy with a flashing blue light on the dash. The driver of the other car pulled him out of his vehicle and stabbed him. Kodadich fought off his attacker and fled to his mother's house. His description of the assailant resembled the murderer at large. To police, James Kodadich was fortunate. His wounds were not serious. An ambulance came to take him to the hospital. Before leaving, he gave the police permission to examine his car for any trace evidence his attacker might have left. Hoping to find evidence linking this incident to the unsolved murders, examiners thoroughly vacuumed the car. It was an early model Chevy, the same type as described by witnesses of the previous 2 murders. Thinking it may just be a strange coincidence, Detective Kennecom took a closer look at the tires.
I looked at the right rear tire of the vehicle, and it was in fact like the tire we were looking for. I then went to my attaché case where I carried a copy of the sketch of the tire with certain important measurements, measured the tire on the right rear of the vehicle, saw some oddities with that particular tire, and made a match.
James Kodatich's vehicle was now linked to the abduction site of 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien, murdered a few weeks before. The killer's third victim became the investigation's prime suspect. To be absolutely certain that the tires matched, investigators turned again to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald. The tire in question is rolled on what's essentially a giant ink pad, leaving an impression of its entire tread circumference on a length of white cardboard. After completing this process on Kodatich's Chevy, investigators sent a negative transparency of the tire impression found at Deirdre O'Brien's abduction site to Peter McDonald. McDonald then compared that to the suspect's tire impression. After 25 hours of scrutiny, McDonald was absolutely certain he'd found what he was looking for.
I was able to make a positive identification because there were many cuts and tears in the tire that were unique to that tire only.
That proved that Kodatich's car was at the scene. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant. Kodatich was still in the hospital when arrested for suspicion of murdering Deirdre O'Brien. When confronted with the tire impression evidence, the suspect admitted making a sharp turn on that stretch of highway, but not at the time of the murder. Though police did not believe him, the evidence was only circumstantial. Investigators had to find another way to build their case. And not just for the murder of Deirdre O'Brien, but also for the murder of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. They wouldn't need to go very far. The fibers collected from Kodatich's car interior were compared against those found on both victims.
Victims' evidence, such as fibers from skirts, were actually found in his car, and then carpet fibers from his vehicle and foam from the seat cushion was actually found on the victims. So there was a cross-link.
Certainly can. No problem.
Despite the evidence against him, Kodatich maintained he was not the killer. He pointed to his stab wound as proof. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the injury. The severity and the angle suggested it was self-inflicted.
How many days ago did you get it?
But why did he bother?
We believe that he thought the police might have had an idea or were looking at him as a suspect in the case, which we weren't, but that's why we believed he made this particular scenario up.
But Kodatich's plan backfired and led investigators right to him. Based on the evidence, police believe that Kodatich prowled for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. For the murders of Amy Hoffman and Deirdre O'Brien, James Kodatich was sentenced to 95 years. Kodatich was difficult to apprehend because his random victims had no connection to him. Most murders aren't random, and the killer goes to great lengths to obliterate the connection between himself and the victim. On May 8, 1993, a young couple at Lake Lou Yeager Park in Illinois frantically summoned the help of the park caretaker. Someone had built a fire in a pile of brush.
In the center was what looked like a mannequin. At first, the couple thought it was a prank, but when they looked closer, they realized whoever did this was deadly serious. The body was real. After the body was pulled from the smoldering pile, the police were notified. Police could discern that the victim was female, but that was all. Her head was missing. They retrieved melted trash bags and a charred cardboard carton from the debris. Detective Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police led the search for more clues.
We brought in Illinois State Police dogs and attempted to search the area for any other possible evidence and the possibility of finding the victim's decapitated head. Those were unsuccessful.
Investigators had no clue who the killer was, and no clue to the victim either. They felt confident that the identity of the victim would lead to her killer. This crime was simply too gruesome to be a random attack.
Anyone who'd go to all that trouble to try to burn a body and to decapitate them went to a lot of trouble because of the association between the suspect and the victim.
For now, their best clue was the victim herself. X-rays revealed fibroid tumors in her uterus, severe enough to cause medical problems. The plastic bags were ordinary trash bags. The cardboard carton was from a self-service moving company. Neither seemed like much of a clue. A forensic anthropologist was called in to determine all he could from the victim's bones. Determining an approximate age, height, and the victim's race would be crucial to matching her with a missing persons report. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Mark Johnsey of the Illinois State Police Crime Lab made the analysis.
The pubic symphysis, which is down the pelvic region, is a very good indicator of age. The pelvic bone in this area changes very diagnostically with age, and based on that I could make an assessment of her age, which I gave her an age range of 35 to 39.
Establishing race was more problematic. Flesh tone is distorted in death, and the fire didn't help that. Dr. Johnsey had to rely on his best judgment under difficult circumstances.
Both the pubic hair and the axillary hair in the armpit, which she had both, was very straight. And she was fairly light-skinned, and with a combination of those features, it was just felt that she was a Caucasian.
Now, investigators needed a name. The most certain way of identifying a person is by fingerprints. But that works only if they can be lifted from the victim and if the victim's prints are on file somewhere. Illinois State Police forensic scientist Gary Havey was assigned the task of seeing that this Jane Doe met those requirements. The victim's hands were removed and sent in sealed cans to his lab. They were dry and stiffened in a clutched position. If Havey hoped to raise any prints, he'd have to amputate individual fingers and soften the tissue.
In the case of Jane Doe, in order to soften the tissue, one of the procedures or methods that I have found to be useful over the last years is to actually soak the fingers in a solution of detergent.
The solution softens the tissue on the friction ridges, which are the unique arches, whorls, and loops on every person's fingertips.
Once the fingers were softened and dried, Havey rolled them in ink and printed their ridge patterns onto white paper. But he wasn't satisfied.
I didn't want just suitable prints, I wanted the absolute best standard we could achieve. We then decided to utilize a different method in obtaining the friction ridge detail from the fingers and palms. Over the years, I've had good success utilizing black powder and frosted lifting tape.
The powder and tape yielded better results, which were then photographed and labeled. They would then be classified and sent to APHIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Joliet, Illinois, which holds fingerprint cards for the entire state. Only Jane Doe's left thumb and index fingers were clear enough for the APHIS computer. Usually, that's all it needs.
At this time, there were 1.7 to 1.8 million cards on file in Joliet. It would be totally impossible for me to manually search all of those cards, but with APHIS, we can actually scan those individual cards in a period of 30 minutes upwards to 2 or 3 hours.
The results came back negative. No matches. The victim and her killer remained anonymous. A nameless murder victim was found burning in an Illinois park. Until investigators could determine the identity of the Caucasian woman, her killer would remain free. Desperate for clues, detectives interviewed witnesses who were in the park the night the body was discovered. 2 students, taking a drive after their prom, reported seeing the fire. Nearby was a cargo van. They believed the tags were from Missouri. The back was open, and they could see plastic trash bags. Detectives were convinced the teenagers next saw the killer.
They actually pull alongside the suspect van, and they're quite alarmed that somebody would actually have a fire in this no-burn area. They're familiar with the park, and basically at that point, the suspect sees the car pull alongside, and he immediately runs and jumps into the van and speeds away.
But without a tag number, it was another untraceable lead. To solve this case, investigators had to identify the victim, who they referred to as Janie Doe. They expanded the APHIS fingerprint search.
We performed APHIS searches in over 45 different APHIS systems throughout the United States, Canada, and even Puerto Rico. This would prove to be the most extensive APHIS search ever undertaken by the Illinois State Police.
Millions of prints were scrutinized, and still no leads. The victim apparently had no criminal record and was not on any database. Likewise, hundreds of missing persons reports were scrutinized over a period of more than 18 months. Though none matched the description of a 30-something Caucasian woman whose fingerprints matched Janie Doe's, one name consistently popped up.
The one constant factor that we continued to see was a victim, Lynn Matcham Thomas, from the greater St. Louis area. She had came on our list before, and we had called St. Louis missing persons and also talked to the homicide squad, but we had discounted the fact that this would be our victim because she was African American.
With no other leads, investigators went to speak with Shirley Matcham, the mother of Lynn Matcham Thomas. Like her daughter, She lived in Missouri, only 50 miles from the Illinois park where the victim was found. Shirley had reported Lynn missing the day before the body was found. According to her mother, Lynn had light skin. Like the victim, she also had fibroid tumors that she was seeing a doctor about. In fact, the day she disappeared, her brother had dropped her off at her doctor's office and made arrangements to pick her up afterward. When he returned, he was 10 minutes late. He went inside, but she was no longer there. He assumed that she grew tired of waiting and decided to walk home. He didn't think anything more about it. Later that night, Mrs. Matcham received a call from Lynn's husband, Curtis Thomas, asking where Lynn might be. He said she'd left his house 20 minutes earlier, and he assumed she'd gone to her mother's. But her mother hadn't seen her all day. Shirley Matcham knew her son-in-law to be violent and suspected the worst. The next day, she filed a missing persons report with the St. Louis Police Department. Investigators reviewed the report. They learned that St. Louis police had followed up with a visit to Lynn's home to speak with her husband, Curtis Thomas. He told them that the night Lynn disappeared, she was moving out of the house. He wasn't happy about it, and they fought. The last time he'd seen her, she was walking away from the house. At first, he thought she'd just run off without her things, but when she didn't show up at her mother's, he thought something serious might have happened. Sifting through the report, investigators found another potential clue.
We also found out that when Lynn Matcham Thomas was discovered missing, that the police had went to the Thomas residence and asked for permission to search the house. Mr. Thomas let him in. They conducted a search on the second and first floors, and when the police asked to go to the basement, Mr. Thomas insisted that he call his attorney, and they terminated the search.
With no victim or any signs of foul play, the missing persons investigation in St. Louis ended. But now, almost 2 years later, investigators in Illinois suspected that the body found in the park was Lynn Matcham Thomas. The timing of her disappearance fit. Her medical condition was the same. And her husband, Curtis Thomas, was becoming the prime suspect. Investigators in Illinois struggled to identify a decapitated woman found burning in a state park. Though they believed she was Shirley Matcham Thomas and that her husband Curtis had put her there, they had to prove it. Investigators went back to Lynn's mother for past employment information about her daughter.
And quite to our surprise, she said that her daughter had been employed by a local bank, and during the course of that employment that she had been fingerprinted. So we were able to go to the St. Louis Police Department now and look in a specific file. Those files were not in any database, and manually had to pull those fingerprints to compare them with our Janie Doe.
The comparison was made. Janie Doe was, in fact, Lynn Matcham Thomas. Because of their stormy marriage, their violent history, and the fact that he was the last one to have seen Lynn, Curtis Thomas became the prime suspect. What police needed was proof. Investigators now tried to find a link between evidence left at the crime scene and the suspect. They determined that a cardboard carton pulled from the fire was from the same moving company that the victim was using to pack her belongings. However incriminating, the evidence was only circumstantial. To learn more about Curtis Thomas and his activities following Lynn's disappearance, investigators located an ex-girlfriend who he started seeing after his wife was reported missing. She said that Curtis claimed the police were stupid for misidentifying the race of Janie Doe. This was several weeks before she was identified as African American. She also added that Curtis had access to a van through his work. It matched the description of the van seen at the park the night of the murder. The girlfriend was frightened of Curtis and ended the relationship. That testimony, along with the rest of the circumstantial evidence they gathered, gave investigators enough to arrest Curtis Thomas in January 1995 for suspicion of murdering his wife almost 2 years earlier. A search warrant for his home was issued. Though Thomas insisted he knew nothing about the fate of his estranged wife, investigators found newspaper clippings regarding the mysterious body in Illinois. Police theorized that the abusive Curtis Thomas was unwilling to let his wife simply walk out on him. Investigators believe that after murdering Lynn Matcham Thomas, he kept the body in the basement until he could get the work van. And to throw investigators off his trail, he beheaded the victim, then transported her to the park in Illinois, where he set the remains on fire. Curtis Thomas was found guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Thomas tried to erase the connection between himself and the victim. Others try to erase all evidence of the crime itself. On September 14, 1985, a motorist on a secluded highway in Utah pulled over to help a frantic man. David Mosman said his pickup truck went off the road in Logan Canyon and plunged 285 feet to the river below. His wife, Tanya, was still down there. The motorist called for help. Though banged up and visibly shaken, Mosman's injuries were relatively minor. He told emergency workers that his wife was conscious when he'd helped her out of the wreck and onto the shore. He begged them to help her. As David Mosman was transported to the hospital, a rescue team was in the canyon, searching in the dark for his wife. About 40 feet from the overturned vehicle, caught on rocks in the middle of the river, lay Tanya Mosman. She was face down in the water, dead. By the time she was retrieved, David Mosman was in the hospital getting his wounds treated. He told the nurse that he glanced off the road for a second to look at his wife. At that instant, the truck went over. He blamed his carelessness for the accident. Investigators arrived at the hospital. They asked the nurse if David was in any shape to make a statement. She told them that his injuries were minor and he needn't stay there. She said that Mosman told her he'd been thrown from the truck just as it went over the embankment. She considered him lucky to be alive. Investigators waited until the next day to get a detailed account of the accident. When asked about his marriage, David Mosman said that things between him and his wife had been shaky. They were going through a bitter divorce, but lately they were working to save their relationship. That night, he'd taken her to a restaurant. They enjoyed themselves and each other. It was like it used to be before their relationship soured. After dinner, they'd headed home. David Mosman had driven that stretch of road dozens of times before. He said he must have taken his eyes off the road as he approached the curb. He said all he remembered was his wife's screams. Confused and shaken, he made his way to the bottom of the canyon. When he reached Tanya, she was partially ejected from the back of the truck. He helped her out and started back up to get help. Utah Highway Patrol Officer Larry Forsgren worked the accident investigation.
He said he put her on the bank and that she was all right, and he had talked to her and she was fine. He said that she did mention that her head hurt a little bit, but other than that, and he didn't see any blood, she wasn't bleeding, and he put her on the bank so then he'd go up and get help.
Mosman said it took him more than 2 hours to climb up the canyon in the dark. He thought he must have blacked out or fallen asleep in the cold. He didn't know how his wife ended up back in the river. In the days following Tanya Mosman's death, accident reconstruction experts studied the spot where the truck went over. On the pavement was a small scuff mark, showing that the steering wheel was turned abruptly off the road at about 20 to 30 miles per hour. For Cache County Deputy Medical Examiner Sergeant George Becker, that fact presented an inconsistency with David Mosman's account.
At that point, the vehicle would tilt up to go off the road as it's going over the bank. It would have been impossible to get out of the vehicle on the driver's side. You'd have to lift the door straight up and climb out while the vehicle is moving. It's impossible.
The routine analysis of the accident had raised more questions than it answered. For investigators, this case demanded a closer look. Police in Utah continued investigating the tragic death of Tanya Mosman, killed when the truck she and her husband David were driving plunged 285 feet into a canyon. David Mosman's account of the accident didn't jibe with the facts. Investigators requested an autopsy on Tanya Mosman. Water in her lungs showed that her cause of death was drowning. A mark from hip to shoulder suggested she'd been wearing her seatbelt, which would have made it impossible for her to be thrown through the back windshield, as her husband claimed. The only other marks to her body were 3 blunt and distinctive contusions on the back of her head. Looking for answers, the forensics team inspected the truck for what might have caused the marks. They also used chemically treated swabs called hemosticks, which turn blue on contact with traces of blood. No blood was found, and no object in the truck could have caused the victim's contusions. Investigators went back to the scene to gather more information. What they found was a length of sprinkler irrigation pipe entangled on the riverbank. David Mosman, a schoolteacher, moonlighted as a sprinkler installer. The pipe was sent to Dr. Kent Glanville of the Logan County Police Department Crime Lab for further examination. He placed the pipe over life-sized photographs of the wounds on Tanya's head. The pipe was a perfect fit. But Mosman had a reason to carry it, and, however unlikely, it might have struck the victim during the truck's tumble. With all the inconsistencies and lingering questions, investigators pressed Mosman to try to remember more details of the accident. He was asked to draw a map of the road and to mark where he lost control and went over. He did it with pinpoint accuracy, something most accident victims can't do.
He was exactly sure that this is where he went off, and it was close to the approximate same area that the vehicle went off. And that was kind of odd because when he went off, it was nighttime, it was dark. And for him to pinpoint it, he had to be pretty familiar with that location. And I got the impression that he knew beforehand where that vehicle was going to go off.
Things that I just don't think anything about.
2 days after the accident, that impression was reinforced when a friend of David Mosman's named Terry contacted police. He said the couple had a difficult marriage and that David was always joking about how he was going to kill Tanya. Chief Prosecutor Jim Jenkins followed the investigation.
David told Terry that he didn't want to go through the expense of a divorce. He didn't want to risk losing custody of the two children. And he didn't want to give any of the property or finances that he had accumulated.
Now trying to prove that David Mosman had murdered his wife, police began interviewing Tanya's friends. They were well aware of the Mosmans' disintegrating marriage. One friend said that Tanya was often terrified of David. Sometimes he was violent. Mostly they fought over the custody of their two young children. She told investigators that David had recently tried to make Tanya sign a document he'd written, forcing her to relinquish custody of their kids if they divorced. He'd even threatened to kill her if she didn't sign it. Even so, Tanya sought legal advice about getting a divorce. Shortly after that, David began acting very nicely to her. Tanya told her friend that she was looking forward to dinner with her husband. She sincerely believed that on the night she died, they would reconcile. It all seemed tragically convenient for David Mosman, so investigators continued to dig. They discovered that David had had a $10,000 life insurance policy on his wife for many years. But 9 months before her death, while their marriage was crumbling, he took out additional policies for an additional $100,000. A motive was firmly established, and the circumstances of Tanya's death were suspicious. Still, it could have been an improbable accident. Investigators had to prove that it wasn't. David Mosman said he left his injured wife on the riverbank, but she was found in the middle of the river.
Investigators hired hydrological engineer Dr. Dave Tullis to see if that was possible.
The deputy wanted me to assess the situation and see if there was any reasonable way that she could have gone from the riverbank where he said he left her to the location in the river in the condition that she was in.
Dr. Tullis measured the river's depth, velocity, and direction of the current to calculate if an object as large as a human body could be carried from the bank and deposited at the spot where the victim was found. He determined that the shallow water near the bank couldn't support a body, and even if it could, the speed and direction of the current would carry it along the edge, not to the middle of the river.
If she was unconscious, she couldn't move, and the current would not have been able to move her along, and so she would have been found right by the riverbank in the unconscious condition or drowned condition.
But she wasn't.
Turn around for me, sir.
She had never been taken to the bank of the river, as her husband had said. David Mosman was arrested for suspicion of murdering his wife. Investigators believe that David Mosman tried to kill Tanya in the premeditated crash. But when she survived, he had to climb down the canyon and finish the job. The motive, apparently, was hatred of his wife, custody of his children, and $110,000 in insurance. For his crimes, David Mosman was sentenced to life in prison. Prisons are filled with people who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. But a murder isn't over once the victim is dead. For investigators, that's just the beginning. They turn to forensic scientists to help bring justice to the victims by exposing a killer's fatal error. A New Jersey woman is found brutally murdered by the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from a few bite marks left on the victim's body. A sadistic predator targets young women in a quiet Canadian community. As police struggle to track him down, the killer threatens more victims. Indiana firefighters discover a woman murdered in her bed. But will dental impressions be enough to convict her killer? Some murderers are compelled to leave a very personal mark on their victims. But with the help of forensic odontologists, police can use those marks to capture those who kill with a deadly smile. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Just after midnight on August 12, 1994, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey were dispatched to a remote area just off Route 1. A battered, semi-nude woman, identified as 25-year-old Melissa Padilla, had been found murdered, lying inside a concrete pipe. Crime technicians began processing the area for clues. They collected several recently purchased grocery items scattered near the body. They also recovered a blood-stained dollar bill and nearby several cigarette butts, which investigators hoped would yield valuable DNA evidence. The victim's discarded shorts, stained with blood, were found nearby. Inside one of the pockets,
was a store receipt for several grocery items, time-stamped 11:29 p.m. While evidence technicians continued processing the scene, Melissa's boyfriend, Hector Gonzalez, who had found her body, was brought in for questioning. He couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt Melissa, a dedicated mother of 4. Hector said that after putting the kids to bed around 11 p.m., Melissa said she wanted to go to a nearby convenience store to pick up a few things. Hector agreed to watch the kids. She said she would be back within a half hour.
Thank you.
When she hadn't returned more than an hour later, he became concerned and asked a friend to help look for her. That's when they found Melissa's battered body along Route 1, the path she normally took to go to the store. Hector later agreed to take a polygraph examination. Test results indicated he had nothing to do with Melissa's murder. Though police had no obvious suspects, the motive behind the murder seemed clear. Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office Lieutenant Lawrence Nagel worked the case.
The woman that was found at the scene was found naked from the waist down. It appeared there was severe trauma to her face area. Initial impressions were that it appeared to be a sexual type of situation.
At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Melissa Padilla had died of manual strangulation. Her face had been viciously beaten. Though it was clear she had been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was recovered. More disturbing was the presence of small contusions on the victim's body. The ones found on Melissa's chin appeared to be bite marks. Knowing the bite marks would be crucial in linking a suspect to the crime, an identification officer with the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office precisely photographed them to scale, using standards developed by the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. For the bite mark evidence to be useful, investigators had to identify a suspect. Trying to retrace Melissa's movements, investigators retrieved the security camera videotape from the store Melissa had been to just before her death. Melissa was clearly visible, purchasing the items found near her body. The amount of change she was seen receiving was the same amount found in her pocket. But no one who appeared in the video looked suspicious. Analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene had little else to offer. Though DNA was found on the cigarette butts, investigators had no way to determine who had left them there or when. And all of the blood that was collected belonged to Melissa. A meticulous search for any suspect fingerprints turned up nothing. Despite the lack of clues to the killer's identity, the bite marks he left behind gave investigators a glimpse into his violent mind. Assistant Prosecutor Thomas Capsack of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked the case.
The nature of the crime suggested anger. The victim was really brutalized. There had to be a lot of pain involved, and we eventually concluded that the bite mark on the chin occurred while he was looking into her eyes while he was causing pain.
Police began focusing their attention on sex offenders known to be living in the area. A state prison facility housing such offenders was located just a few miles from the crime scene. And several inmates had recently been released. Investigators tracked each one of them down. All denied knowledge of Melissa Padilla's murder. And all were eventually cleared by polygraph examinations. Investigators scoured dozens of homicide cases looking for one with a similar MO. But despite their efforts, 8 months passed with no progress in the investigation of Melissa Padilla's murder. But in April 1995, investigators received a call from the Maine State Police. Authorities there were requesting background information on a Woodbridge, New Jersey resident, 31-year-old Stephen Fortin, who was in their custody for sexually assaulting a female Maine state trooper. For Lieutenant Nagel, the details of the assault sounded eerily familiar.
It was revealed during a conversation with the Maine State Police that the trooper, during the assault by Stephen Fortin, was bitten in the same immediate areas that Melissa Padilla was bitten on.
Hoping this was the break they had been waiting for, investigators traveled to Maine to speak with the trooper, who was still recovering in the hospital. Investigators immediately noticed that the trooper had sustained bite marks on her chin, the same spot where Melissa Padilla had been bitten. The off-duty trooper said she saw a car parked on the side of the road, facing oncoming traffic.
Open the window.
Concerned, she pulled over.
You having trouble with your car tonight?
The driver claimed to be having mechanical problems,
Okay, I need you to
but
step
the
out of
trooper
car,
noticed
sir.
a strong alcohol smell.
Okay, stay right there. Okay, don't move. Don't move. Okay.
She administered a breathalyzer test, which confirmed that the man was intoxicated. As the trooper radioed into the station for backup, the man suddenly attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was in the passenger seat of her patrol car. She was in a great deal of pain and suddenly realized she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Believing the assailant was planning to kill her, the trooper jumped out of the car. The driver continued on. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Her assailant, Stephen Fortin, was taken into custody less than an hour later. After examining and photographing the trooper's injuries, one thing became clear. The assault on the state trooper and the murder of Melissa Padilla bore the same ritualistic signature.
Ritual involves getting sexual gratification from the crime you commit. The signature in our case really was the ritual, and that is the beating to the eyes and the nose, the bite mark on the chin.
Come over here and check.
For investigators, the similar MO of the two assaults had to be more than just a coincidence. New Jersey police went to the jail in Kennebec County, Maine, to question Fortin about the Melissa Padilla homicide. Though Fortin admitted to living in Woodbridge, New Jersey at the time, he insisted he didn't know anyone named Melissa Padilla and denied any knowledge of her murder. He also denied ever being in the area along Route 1, where Melissa's body was found. But he didn't deny his involvement in the assault on the female trooper, though he claimed he had acted in self-defense. Investigators collected hair and blood samples to compare to evidence recovered from the Melissa Padilla crime scene. Though investigators finally had a strong suspect in the young woman's homicide, they were still a long way from proving that Stephen Fortin was her killer. With only bite mark evidence to work with, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey struggled to solve the brutal murder of Melissa Padilla, a 25-year-old mother of 4.
Why don't you move to Maine?
After several months with no leads, police learned of a similar assault more than 300 miles away in Maine. And the suspect in that case, Stephen Fortin, had recently moved there from Woodbridge. While waiting for DNA analysis, New Jersey authorities interviewed Fortin's friends and associates. They located an ex-girlfriend who still lived in Woodbridge.
She had plenty to say about Steve Fortin. She said their turbulent 4-month relationship suddenly came to a violent halt after Fortin assaulted her during an argument they had while taking a walk along Route 1. She added that after their fight, Fortin returned to apologize. The girlfriend noticed cuts and scratches on Fortin's face and hands. Fortin explained that he feared she had called the police, and he fled through the woods to avoid them. She believed the incident had taken place on August 12th. Not only was that the night Melissa was murdered, but the girlfriend had put Fortin on Route 1, an area he previously claimed he had never been to. Though investigators were now convinced that Fortin was Melissa Padilla's killer, DNA analysis on the cigarette butt found near her body was inconclusive. Examiners analyzed all of the evidence found at the crime scene again, hoping something may have been overlooked. But nothing was found. For Identification Officer Jim O'Brien, it was clear that the bite marks would be the crucial link connecting Stephen Fortin to Melissa's murder.
The DNA results were inconclusive. We had no hairs or fibers from Stephen Fortin found on the victim's body, and I never developed any fingerprints on any of the evidence that came back to anyone except the victim herself. Therefore, the photographs of the bite marks on the victim's body were very, very important in terms of physical evidence and in terms of putting Stephen Fortin at this crime scene.
In April 1995, Stephen Fortin was taken to the office of Dr. Brian Morin, a dentist in Waterville, Maine. To prove Fortin had made the bite marks on Melissa's body, investigators first needed models detailing every unique feature of his teeth. First, photographs of the suspect's teeth are taken using a millimeter ruler, so examiners can accurately determine the scale of the photos for later comparisons to pictures of the victim's injuries. Then, impressions of the upper and lower teeth are taken using a substance called dental stone, a material similar to plaster. After the molds are allowed to harden, Morin then grinds them down to remove excess material, allowing examiners to clearly see the unique features of the teeth. The molds of the suspect's teeth, in addition to life-size photographs of the bite mark injuries, are all examiners need to perform the analysis. Dr. Tom Richardson, a forensic odontologist in Portland, Maine, explains the process.
The molds of teeth are the casts. They are the likeness of the individual's teeth in size and in shape. The photos are from the individual or medium that was bitten, and they are life size as well. We take the casts, put an overlay, go up against the marks on the photo, and we either are going to have a match if the photos are good and the marks are there, or we're not going to.
Using a computer program, examiners demonstrated how the casts made of Stephen Fortin's teeth lined up perfectly with the bite marks on the victim's chin.
Photographs here.
The spacing between Fortin's teeth, the dimensions of the arches of his bite, and the unique details of his teeth were all consistent with the injuries on both victims. Detectives now had the physical proof they needed to charge Stephen Fortin with the murder of Melissa Padilla. Police believe that Stephen Fortin chanced upon Melissa as she returned from the convenience store. Still enraged by the argument with his girlfriend, Fortin brutally beat, bit, and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. In February 2001, he was sentenced to death in New Jersey for the murder and aggravated sexual assault of Melissa Padilla. He also pled guilty to charges stemming from the beating and sexual assault on the Maine state trooper.
he received the maximum 20-year sentence. Stephen Fortin found gratification in a brutal ritual. But 3,000 miles away in Canada, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, one killer took perverse satisfaction from taunting the detectives on his trail. Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, October 14, 1995. In the early morning hours, officers from the Abbotsford Police Department were dispatched to a hospital emergency room. There, they found 16-year-old Melissa Connor, still recovering from a brutal beating she sustained a few hours earlier. Melissa told investigators that she and a friend, Tracy Sawyer, were on their way to a party when a man wielding a baseball bat jumped out of the bushes and attacked them. During the struggle, Melissa was knocked unconscious. When she came to, Tracy and the assailant were nowhere in sight. Though her recollection of the attack was still a bit hazy, Melissa was certain she had never seen the man before. Investigators rushed to the scene of the assault to search for Tracy. But only one item found at the scene suggested that a struggle had taken place. A single hoop earring that belonged to the missing teenager. Inspector Rod Gale of the Abbotsford Police Department hoped a canvass of the neighborhood would yield information.
There were witnesses in the area of the crime scene, but the witnesses that we established there had only heard screams in the early hours of the morning, and no one had actually seen anything.
Okay. Investigators feared that the 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer had been abducted, or worse. And with no suspects to pursue, they knew that time was working against them. A description of the missing teenager and details of the assault were distributed to all area law enforcement agencies. A few hours later, a man fishing along the Vedder River noticed something on the riverbank. As he moved closer to get a better look, he realized he had found a human body. Officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who responded to the scene found that the young female victim had been savagely beaten and raped. Police scoured the shoreline for clues that could help them identify the young woman and her killer. But they found nothing. Still, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed this was the missing Abbotsford girl. Sergeant Kevin McLeod.
The obvious connection to me to the Abbotsford case was the fact that Abbotsford had a missing girl and we had a dead girl. And this close vicinity of the two communities.
Dental records confirmed that the woman found at the Vedder River was Tracy Sawyer. The medical examiner confirmed that the young woman had been raped. He also noted massive blunt force trauma to her head. But that wasn't what killed her. The official cause of death was ruled a drowning. The only clues to the killer's identity were bite marks on the victim's torso. The impressions were carefully photographed and preserved as evidence. The photos were sent to the Bureau of Legal Dentistry Laboratory in Vancouver. There, Dr. David Sweet, a recognized expert in forensic odontology, examined the evidence. After studying the bite mark injuries, he realized there was the potential for additional evidence to be obtained.
A new technique was available for recovering saliva from a bite mark, and we could even determine if DNA was available from the saliva, and then possibly match that back to the suspect when and if one was made available.
The theory behind the technique, referred to as double swabbing, is that saliva from the suspect's mouth is transferred into the bite marks left on the victim. As demonstrated here, Dr. Sweet first dampens a sterile swab with distilled water, then wipes it across the impressions, rehydrating any saliva cells in the bite marks. Then, he applies a second dry swab to the wounds, which will act as a sponge and collect the rehydrated cells that contain the suspect's DNA. Dr. Sweet performed the procedure on the teeth impressions found on Tracy Sawyer. And though she had been submerged in water for some time, he was confident the double swabbing technique would yield DNA evidence.
Despite the fact that the body had been in water, the saliva is sticky enough in order to remain there, and if you can use some methods to collect that evidence that's there, even in trace forms, you'll have enough to test and to analyze.
The procedure was successful. Minute traces of the killer's DNA was collected. But for that evidence to be useful, investigators would now have to find a way to identify a suspect. A forensic odontologist had successfully extracted the killer's DNA from bite marks found on 16-year-old murder victim Tracy Sawyer. But for the evidence to be useful, police in Abbotsford, British Columbia, now had to identify a suspect. They turned to the victim's parents for information.
That night, she was going out with her best friend.
The couple said that the last time they saw Tracy was shortly before the assault. She and her friend, Melissa Connor, were leaving for a party at a neighborhood friend's house. They promised not to be out too late. Tracy seemed upbeat and excited about the party.
That night, she looked so happy.
The couple couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt their beautiful young daughter. In addition to releasing limited details of the investigation to the media, police also set up a tip line for potential witnesses to call with information. Soon after, a call came in. The man on the other end claimed to be Tracy's killer. He described in detail the bite mark found on the victim's body.
The only people that would know about it were the people at the autopsy, the doctors, the policemen attending the autopsy, and the immediate core team of the investigation. So it had to be the individual that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene to know about that bite mark.
Police traced the call to a nearby payphone and rushed to the scene. But no one was there. Technicians thoroughly dusted the phone for any fingerprints the suspect may have left behind. None were found. A short while later, Abbotsford police dispatchers received a 911 call. During the conversation, which was recorded by police, a man identified himself as the killer. He wanted to know if police were having trouble finding him. He said he would never be so stupid as to leave his prints at the payphone.
Hey, where are you going to be?
He also promised to kill again.
Hello? Are you there?
It's not very often that a suspect starts phoning the police and threatening to attack again, threatening to do the same thing over again, and basically taunting that you're not going to be able to catch me, I'm going to do this again.
Desperate to stop this killer before he struck again, police turned back to Melissa Connor, the young woman who had survived the assault that had claimed the life of her best friend. Though her memory of the events had not fully recovered, she tried to describe the assailant to a sketch artist the best she could. She remembered the man as being a tall, white male, balding, but with reddish-brown hair. The information was enough for police to formulate a composite sketch, which was quickly released through the media. The press dubbed him the Abbotsford Killer. A few days later, a woman came forward with information. She recognized the man in the sketch. He appeared to be the same man who had attacked her with a baseball bat several months before. When shown a photo lineup, she picked out a man named John Eller. For the first time in the murder investigation, authorities had a viable suspect. In November 1995, more than a month after Tracy Sawyer's murder, detectives arrested John Eller at his home. He vehemently denied being the Abbotsford Killer. After taking impressions of the suspect's teeth, forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet compared them to the bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body. But investigators would be frustrated by the results of his analysis.
It became obvious very quickly that the spacing and the shapes of his teeth were much different than the teeth that would be necessary to cause this bite mark.
And DNA samples from the suspect did not match the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite marks. John Eller was eventually cleared as a suspect in Tracy's murder. Soon after, the taunting phone calls from the Abbotsford Killer resumed. Frustrated, authorities came up with a plan. Convinced that someone somewhere knew the killer, they decided to release the recordings of the Abbotsford Killer's taunting phone calls made to police.
The general public were able to hear a large variety of voice characteristics of the individual that was calling us, and that was our goal. We also had that tape on a callback line at the police office, so anybody could call a designated number and just listen to the tape. They didn't have to talk to a police officer, they could just phone and listen to the tape over and over again.
The plan appeared to be a success. A woman who listened to the recordings came forward. She recognized the voice. Detectives played the tape for her again. She told them it sounded like a man named Terry Driver.
So you're positive that's your son?
She knew the voice, she said, because Terry Driver was her son. And she knew that he owned a police scanner and listened to it often at his home. Detectives quickly began checking Driver's background. Though he had no criminal record, the 32-year-old printer lived with his wife and 2 kids in the same neighborhood where the taunting phone calls had originated. Terry Driver was brought in for questioning. Though Driver adamantly denied being the Abbotsford Killer, detectives collected hair and saliva for DNA analysis. Photographs and wax casts of Driver's teeth were also taken. At the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, Dr. Sweet looked for similarities between Driver's dental evidence and bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body.
I produced a clear overlay with the biting edges of his teeth recorded on it at life size, and then compared that to the photographs that were enlarged to life size also.
Dr. Sweet identified several unique characteristics in the suspect's bite that convinced him that Terry Driver's teeth were consistent with the bite marks on Tracy Sawyer's body.
He had some chipped teeth as well as some crowding or rotations of teeth so that they were out of position and not where you would normally find them. This made his teeth unique from everybody else's, and those features were recorded in the bite mark also.
But the irrefutable proof came from the DNA analysis. Terry Driver's DNA profile matched the profile of the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite mark injuries. Dr. Sweet's double swabbing technique helped police clinch their case against a sadistic killer.
To answer any questions now without your lawyer present.
Terry Driver was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer and the attempted murder of her friend, Melissa Connor. Based on the evidence, Abbotsford police believed Terry Driver was a sick predator driven by an insatiable need for attention. On October 14, 1995, that craving exploded into violence. As Melissa Connor and Tracy Sawyer made their way to a nearby party, Driver attacked them without warning. After viciously raping and killing Tracy, Driver set out to taunt police and to prove that he was invincible. In October of 1997, Terry Driver was convicted of the sexual assault slaying of Tracy Sawyer and sentenced to life in prison. He received an additional 10 years for the attempted murder of Melissa Connor. Terry Driver was compelled to call attention to his crimes. But in Indiana, another murderer went to great lengths to conceal his guilt. On October 6, 1990, at 11:37 p.m., firefighters in Shelbyville, Indiana, responded to a blaze at a nearby apartment complex. The fire was coming from the bedroom of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, a tenant who lived on the second floor. After extinguishing the fire on the bed, one of the firefighters made a grisly discovery: the badly burned body of a woman. And the strong smell of lighter fluid led rescue workers to conclude that this fire was no accident. After extinguishing a blaze in an apartment in Shelbyville, Indiana, firefighters had uncovered the badly burned remains of a woman lying in a bed. And according to Chief Kurt Etherton of the Shelbyville Police Department, all indications suggested she had been the victim of a homicide.
It appeared a fire had been started either on or around the bed. There was an inverted V pattern, which is consistent with a fire where accelerants had been used. So it was our opinion that the fire had been set at that point.
After confirming that the victim was the tenant, 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, evidence technicians began searching for clues to tell them who had started the deadly blaze and why. Several latent prints were located and preserved as evidence. But later analysis revealed they all belonged to the victim. Investigators also collected 2 different brands of cigarette butts. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles, and neither matched the victim. It appeared Shirley Sturgill's killer, or killers, had unsuccessfully tried to burn away any trace of evidence from the crime scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had not died as a result of the fire. She had been strangled to death. She had also been sexually assaulted. But the biological evidence recovered was too degraded for a thorough analysis. And there was more. Several marks were found on the victim's torso, stomach, and thigh. The ME concluded they were bite marks made from human teeth. For investigators, they were the strongest link to Shirley's killer.
That person told us that if we had a suspect, that they could take impressions and he would be able to determine whether or not those bite marks were made by a particular person, because there were some distinctive markings on the bites that would be consistent with someone's teeth not being aligned straight.
What time was it when
Detectives began their hunt for Shirley Sturgill's killer by speaking with her daughter. Angie Carr said she and her mother were very close. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She described her mother as a kind, sensitive, and selfless woman who dedicated her life to Angie's happiness and well-being. She was also a wonderful grandmother to Angie's young children. Angie had spoken to her mother on the phone just an hour or so before firefighters were called to the apartment. There didn't seem to be anything troubling her mother. The victim did mention during the conversation that her next-door neighbor, Jerry Donaldson, was there visiting at the time. It was a name already familiar to detectives. Arson investigators who had responded to Shirley's apartment the night of the murder said a neighbor was asking a lot of questions and seemed to know specific details of the crime itself. His name was Jerry Donaldson.
They said that the neighbor was telling several things about the crime that he felt no one else would probably know.
So when did you last...
Donaldson was brought in for questioning. He admitted visiting Shirley the night she died. She had hurt her back recently, and he checked in on her periodically to see if she needed anything. He said they watched TV, and about 10:30, after smoking a cigarette, he went home. When asked how he knew so much about the murder, Donaldson claimed he'd overheard the firefighters talking. He agreed to provide hair samples for a DNA analysis.
Where were you?
Donaldson's DNA was consistent with DNA recovered from one of the cigarette butts found in the victim's apartment. And though he had never denied being there, investigators were convinced he knew more about the murder than he claimed. On October 24th, nearly 3 weeks after Shirley Sturgill's murder, police arrested Jerry Donaldson on suspicion of murder. They also obtained a court order requiring impressions of his teeth to be made. A forensic odontologist overlaid impressions of the suspect's teeth over photographs of Shirley Sturgill's bite mark injuries. Though they didn't line up perfectly, the examiner felt that the two were consistent. But the suspect's lawyer saw to it that Donaldson would never stand trial for murder.
The defense team hired, I think, 2 different odontologists from other parts of the country who had differing opinions than the odontologists we used. The prosecutor and his staff sat down with the defense team and went over the discrepancies, which eventually led to the release of the suspect.
For Shelbyville detectives, the setback was frustrating. The investigation into Shirley Sturgill's savage murder had ground to a halt. Investigators were back to square one, and with no obvious suspects to pursue.
We're going to start back in the set.
Shelbyville, Indiana police struggled to solve the brutal homicide of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill. Though teeth marks had been found on the victim's body, investigators had no other clues to the killer's identity. A year after the homicide, the case was turned over to Captain Bill Dwenger.
One of the things that struck me as odd, it was the amount of anger or rage that was built up inside someone that could inflict these type of injuries on another human being.
After re-examining dozens of witness statements taken over the previous year, Dwenger noticed that several people had commented that Shirley and her son-in-law had not gotten along. Though that didn't seem so unusual, investigators decided to talk with Shirley's daughter Angie again, and to her husband, John Del Carr.
Could I just get a copy of the...
Mr. Carr, we're here investigating the murder.
John Del Carr was upfront about his feelings for his mother-in-law. He didn't like her, and they argued often. Mostly about Shirley's constant interfering with his marriage.
On October 6th,
He said that on the night of the murder, he was with an old army buddy who was visiting from out of town. He hadn't seen Shirley that day. Angie corroborated her husband's alibi. Though John Del Carr was still considered a suspect, police had no evidence against him.
Okay, I think you need to get on that.
But a month later, detectives learned that John Del Carr had been arrested for murdering a young woman in nearby Hamilton County, Indiana. Though no bite marks were left on this victim, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The same MO as the murder of Shirley Sturgill.
Yeah, I did the girl in Hamilton. That's what I'm in here.
Shelbyville detectives drove to the state prison to speak with John Del Carr and obtain potential evidence. But the suspect was uncooperative and refused to answer any questions. Investigators ultimately collected hair and blood samples for DNA comparisons with evidence recovered from Shirley's apartment. At the crime lab, examiners concluded that John Del Carr's DNA was consistent with DNA from one of the cigarette butts found in Shirley's bedroom. John Del Carr had been at the victim's apartment, something he previously denied. Though it was strong circumstantial evidence, it didn't prove that he was the killer. There was only one way investigators could make their case. They needed impressions of John Del Carr's teeth to compare to the bite marks found on Shirley Sturgill's body.
Taken care of.
But so far, they lacked probable cause to obtain a warrant to force the suspect to provide the samples. And they knew that without that evidence, it would be difficult to get a conviction.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We needed to know, and the jury's going to need to know, did we get his dental impressions? Did they match up to the bite marks on the body of Shirley Sturgill? Without that, I'm not sure a jury would be able to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we needed that information, whether it was going to be, yes, they do match up, or no, they do not.
On August 3rd, 1994, almost 4 years after the murder, investigators finally got a break. Angie Carr had since divorced her husband, and now that he was in prison, she wanted to talk. She believed John Del Carr had in fact murdered her mother. She admitted to having lied to police before, but out of fear for her safety and the safety of her children. According to Angie, John came home very late the night of the murder. Suddenly, he grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at her, and told her he had hurt her mother.
You understand me? Come here. Come on. Come on. Get over here.
He dragged her to the room where her children were sleeping and threatened to kill her and them if she ever said anything. Angie told police that John kept up his threats in the following months.
The kids' room.
Besides hurting your back.
And she believed he wouldn't hesitate to carry them out.
Put a shotgun to their heads and threatened to kill them too.
John Carr's wife, I believe, was genuinely terrified of John. She knew what he was capable of. I think she did what she had to do to protect herself and her children.
It was the break detectives had been waiting for. Angie's testimony was enough for investigators to obtain a court order to force John Del Carr to give teeth impressions. Investigators contacted forensic odontologist Dr. John Kenney, the deputy coroner for DuPage County, Illinois.
I was asked to go to the state prison and to meet with Mr. Carr in the dental infirmary and to take his impressions and any other records as I would need to make a bite mark comparison.
Okay. But John Del Carr still refused to cooperate.
Okay.
Investigators received another court order, this time giving them the authority to anesthetize the suspect in order to obtain the evidence.
It was possible in this particular case to, because of the configuration of Mr. Carr's teeth, several of his teeth were misaligned and crowded, particularly on the upper arch, to take the model of his teeth and fit it right to the injury in one of these positive replicas.
All of the unique characteristics of John Del Carr's teeth matched the injuries present on Shirley Sturgill's body. There was no doubt that his teeth had left the wounds. Police believe that on October 6, 1990, John Del Carr, resentful of his mother-in-law's interference in his marriage, drove to her apartment and confronted her. His anger exploded into violence. Carr beat, bit, and sexually assaulted Shirley Sturgill before strangling her to death. After, he set her apartment on fire, hoping all traces of his crime would burn away. In April 1997, John Del Carr was convicted of the first-degree murder of his mother-in-law, Shirley Sturgill. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Some killers are driven to leave a very personal mark on their victims. When police have little other evidence to work with, they turn to forensic odontologists, who seize upon those marks to take the bite out of a killer's deadly smile.